Do not go down this path. Australia joins international condemnation of Israel's plans for Gaza. But will another strongly worded statement achieve much? The acting Prime Minister joins us this morning. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. After nearly 2 years of devastating war, Israel is now set to expand its operations in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu is ignoring critics at home and abroad, including those who marched on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He wants to take full control of Gaza, remove what's left of Hamas, and then hand the territory over to some sort of Arab force. Australia, the UK, Germany and others fear this will only aggravate a catastrophic humanitarian situation and further endanger the lives of hostages. But words of condemnation and even statements of Palestinian recognition are so far doing little to deter the Netanyahu government. The man with the most influence, US President Donald Trump, says it's up to Israel to decide what to do.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel intends to take military control of the entire Gaza Strip.
Well, we don't want to keep it. We want to hand it over to Arab forces that will govern it properly.
Israel's Security Cabinet have approved Benjamin Netanyahu's plan
for a military takeover of Gaza City.
We know Israeli military leadership feels that the military is overstretched.
What we're seeing here is probably a tempering of Benjamin Netanyahu's plan.
As international pressure grows to end the war in the region.
It's directly endangering the hostages.
There's nothing left to occupy.
That's going to be pretty much up to Israel.
Enough is enough.
Keir Starmer called the move wrong.
This is wrong.
And Germany says it won't be sending any more military equipment that could be used in the territory.
Penny Wong has urged Israel to refrain.
We're strongly opposed to this decision.
What would such an occupation achieve? I think that's a good question to ask Israel.
How this war is conducted on the ground to bring it to an end is ultimately a matter for the Israeli government.
The biggest protest across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in more than 2 decades.
I think this is a wake-up call for Australian politics.
The entire international community is distressed by what we're seeing happening in Gaza.
I've supported Israel since October 7th, but I want to know what the end game is.
This war could end tomorrow if Hamas released the hostages and laid down their arms.
There is a risk that there will be no Palestine left to recognise if the world does not act.
As Australia inches towards formally recognising a Palestinian state.
There can't be peace and security in the Middle East without there being an advance on that two-state solution.
They are waiting for Washington to give them permission to do the most basic actions.
Will you talk to Donald Trump before you make a decision about Palestinian recognition?
We're a sovereign government. And Australia makes decisions on behalf of the Australian government. It's a matter of when, not if.
And the latest action of Israel we've seen in the last 24 hours is wrong, and actually it risks, violating international law.
My guest this morning is the acting Prime Minister Richard Marles. First, let's check what's making news. The families of hostages being held in Gaza have marched on Israel's military headquarters in Tel Aviv. They're protesting against the expansion of military operations in Gaza, fearing hostages will be killed. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his New Zealand counterpart have issued a joint statement after meeting in Queenstown, warning any move by Israel to take control of Gaza City risks violating international law. Meanwhile, Germany, which provides around 30% of Israel's arms imports, has suspended defence sales for any weapons that could be used in Gaza. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has rejected suggestions his country could cede land to Russia. It comes after US President Donald Trump suggested a peace deal could involve some swapping of territories. Trump is set to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday in Alaska. We're going to start with the Middle East. The Albanese government has been preparing the ground to announce Australia will join others in recognising a Palestinian state. Israel's decision to escalate operations in Gaza, however, does come as a reality check. The French, British, Canadian announcements on Palestinian recognition, well, they're not deterring Benjamin Netanyahu. Quite the opposite. Australia is still likely to take the step in coming weeks, but it's not going to convince Israel to change course, particularly when it's facing little pushback from the United States. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Melissa Clarke, Anna Henderson and Sarah Ison. Very good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Mel, there's a lot of detail we don't know about Benjamin Netanyahu's plans in Gaza, when it starts, who would ultimately take control, how long that might take. But what do we know about what he's trying to do?
Well, he's made it clear that he wants to send in a force that would go to at least Gaza City, possibly beyond, given there were earlier discussions about a much broader occupation even than that. And then this amorphous idea of handing over to Arab forces, that it's very unclear what that would involve, even if they want to do that. I think what we can see from Benjamin Netanyahu is yet another military tactic, but no political strategy here. There's no end game that is feasible that this operation fits into, which I think has been a consistency we've seen throughout this process. Is there is a lot of focus on the next military step, but no progression towards an ultimate political outcome.
And the international reaction to this, Anna, that we've seen over the last 24 hours or so, has it been predictable? Has anything been surprising? Is any of it likely to have any effect?
I think the international community is trying to work out how to respond to what is appearing to become an immovable force of the Netanyahu government, which is spoken about particularly by the Australian opposition as a democratic country that we need to defend its right to defend itself. But increasingly, it's becoming clear that the kinds of means, letter writing, of appealing, of sanctions, of now Germany moving to act on the front of not providing weapons. Like, that's a pretty big decision.
That might have some impact.
Yes.
That goes beyond the sort of statements and so on. This is a real, we're not going to sell you arms.
It feels like tests are being applied to try and see, does anything change the trajectory of what the Netanyahu government plans to do? And the idea of this move towards Palestinian statehood has been staggered. It hasn't been all countries moving together on one day in the way that the letters have been written or other UN votes have been made.
But is that having much impact? I mean, Netanyahu's clearly going the other direction.
It doesn't seem to be changing what the Netanyahu government does. Does it change the reality internationally that all these countries are now moving in what appears to be a kind of lockstep step in a staggered way to make this statement and at some point act in a further way? Who knows what that way will be? This is the question that is being asked. And then for the Australian government, have they acted soon enough?
Yeah, and look, I still think the US is going to be key on when it comes to putting pressure on Israel. But looking at the situation politically here in Australia, Sarah, you've got the Australian government again condemning Israel for doing this. On the other side, the opposition, it's a little bit mixed. You had Michaeli Cash, we saw, the Shadow Foreign Minister, very strong, very staunch in defending Israel. It's up to them to decide what they're going to do. Andrew Hastie, however, does have some concern.
For Israel, I want to know what the end game is. This war's been going on for two years. They were right to go after Hamas. They were right to fight for their hostages. There are still hostages being held. But what's the end game here? And I think that's what a lot of Australians are asking as well.
Of course, he has combat experience. He fought in a war that didn't have an end game for a very, very, very long time, the forever war in Afghanistan. What's the significance of that, do you think?
Of this, and more broadly what we're seeing from some ranks within the coalition, there is concern around the tone that the opposition has, particularly Michaeli Cash's tone. Now, the majority of that concern is coming from the moderates, but not all. There are some in her Conservative faction that are also starting to think that maybe we need to start changing a bit of the messaging around that.
I mean, Andrew Hastie's not a moderate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there are more and more Conservatives as well. I think what Michaeli Cash would also say about the Israel statement, in her view, is it's actually not backing Israel. I am saying that I'm endorsing your move into Gaza.
No, it's about they should have the right to make
exactly.
Neither
backing nor condemning, seeing what happens, particularly given the occupation hasn't yet happened. We're not sure exactly when it's going to happen. So from her point of view, it's keeping her powder dry. But there is a growing concern within the coalition, again, mostly moderates, but there are increasingly more conservative figures that are also wondering about the wisdom of putting putting Michaela Cash in that role during such a controversial war. Now, of course, you know, you can say that, but that appointment, we all know who Michaela Cash is, how she operates, what she thinks. To act as if this is a surprise is also, it's a little bit questionable. And Michaela has made sure to tell people what I'm saying is in lockstep with the opposition leader, with Susan Lee.
There was a suggestion, though, when she took on the role behind the scenes that she was going to try and emulate Simon Birmingham's style, that Michaela Cash was going to change her approach. And as soon as we sat down to interview her about this conflict, it was very clear that that wasn't the case. But behind the scenes, there had been a suggestion from the highest levels of the coalition that she was intending to have a different and more perhaps nuanced, balanced approach to foreign affairs. And one of the biggest issues, I think, for both sides of politics around this has been the rote learning of particular phrases and sentences to answer any question about the conflict. Whether it speaks to the fact that people are scared of going beyond the bounds of those statements, or whether people don't know enough about the detail of the conflict is unclear to me. But I think for many in Australia who are more familiar with events in the Middle East, these kinds of pat phrases that keep getting rehearsed and recycled to answer any question about what's happening at the moment are not washing.
And just on the government's consideration of when to make any sort of commitment to recognise a Palestinian state, what conditions to attach to that, Mel, the expectation is still that this will happen before the Prime Minister pops up at the UN General Assembly in late September. Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, this week did add a new argument to sort of build these blocks in support of getting there to recognition.
The reason for urgency behind recognition is this: there is a risk that there will be no Palestine left to recognise if the world does not act.
And that, of course, Mel, in the context of what happened at the end of the week with this move now to take control at least of Gaza City and then the rest of the territory.
It certainly highlights the point Penny Wong was trying to make, but I think what we see the Australian government doing is what we're seeing much of the international community doing, which is recognising that any discussions to this, any moves to try and move towards a peace process to this point have not succeeded, that ceasefire talks were not making progress, that we are stuck in a stalemate with Israel making conditions that Hamas would never agree to, with Hamas making conditions that Israel would, you know, perhaps reasonably never agree to either. That doesn't give us any way forward. We are seeing these international moves from France and the Arab League states to begin with in an effort to try and disrupt the status quo, and it's having perhaps unintended consequences. It certainly seems to be pushing Bibi Netanyahu to the opposite direction, I think, than what those nations would have hoped for from that. But at the moment, there needs to be a big change, because at the moment, we're just having an entrenched status quo. Now, can Australia's recognition make a difference? Is that in itself big enough to change the status quo? Probably not. But can it play a role in other broader machinations that are clearly going to happen over the next couple of weeks as we come up to this UN General Assembly in September? That's what the Australian government is hoping it can do with this one little card that it has.
Yeah, what then about other arguments as to other things we could do? I mean, the Greens are saying sanction, and you look at Germany, we're just talking about are going to block arms sales. Will this argument gain more momentum, do you think, Anna, that Australia, if recognition isn't going to change Netanyahu's mind, sanctions might?
I mean, the Prime Minister has been asked directly about sanctions quite recently and was in some ways quite dismissive of taking actions which for Australia wouldn't have the same implications as for Germany. I mean, we do provide some parts for some of the planes that end up, the F-35s that end up there, but they go to the US, and its components, the Greens say they should be part of the discussion, but Australia doesn't have as many levers to pull in terms of what it directly does. At the same time, Australia doesn't broadcast sanctions decisions in advance either. Who knows, we might see something happen in the near term that hasn't been up until this point canvassed. But no, I don't think Australia's decision making on its own is the point here, but I think what President Macron, what the Arab countries that have been partnering with him have been trying to do is say to Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, look at the world that you say you're a part of, the democratic, liberal world you say you're a part of, and everybody eventually is going to be standing up apart from the US at this point,
well, that's
to
the
say
thing.
it's wrong.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, time to talk now to the acting Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Richard Marles. And to take us there, here was the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, suggesting ceasefire talks over Gaza collapsed after France and the UK announced plans to recognise a Palestinian state.
The talks with Hamas fell apart on the day Macron made the unilateral decision that he's going to recognize a Palestinian state. And then you have other people come forward, other countries say, well, if there's not a ceasefire by September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Well, if I'm Hamas, I basically conclude, let's not do a ceasefire, because we can be rewarded.
Richard Marles, welcome to the program. Do you agree these announcements to recognise a Palestinian state encouraged Hamas to abandon ceasefire talks?
Well, the question of recognition ultimately sits under what has been a bipartisan position in Australia, but in many countries around the world, in support of a two-state solution. And ultimately, if you support a two-state solution, what that means is that you support the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people to a state, but also you understand that the only enduring pathway to peace is to have two states living side by side with each's security mutually assured as a result of there being a two-state solution. Now, I think recognition conversations are happening in that context.
But Marco Rubio's point we just heard there was that France announces it's going to recognise a Palestinian state. Hamas then says no to the ceasefire talks. It's encouraged. Do you agree with Marco Rubio or not?
Well, all I can say is that from an Australian point of view, we have consistently said that Hamas can have no role in any future Palestinian state. And more than that, from October 7 onwards, we have condemned all the actions of Hamas. We have made clear that the actions of Hamas have actually undermined the prospects of there being a recognition of a Palestinian state, of the establishment of a two-state solution, and that the role of Hamas is fundamentally negative in relation to all of this, and that what Hamas must do is end its hostilities in respect of all of this and see a return to of the hostages to Israel. So we've been very clear about our position on Hamas.
I'm just wondering if you could be clear on this, though. Do you agree or disagree with Marco Rubio that recognition encourages Hamas?
Well, I think recognition is a separate question. I mean, what we say in relation to recognition, and it is important to talk about the factors that are part of recognition, and we have articulated as we have discussed this question that there can be no role for Hamas in a future Palestinian state. So there's no encouragement to Hamas in any of the conversations that we have been having in relation to recognition. But when you look at the way in which different countries around the world have taken this step, they have done so in a way consistent with what we've done in saying that Hamas can have no role in a future Palestinian state. And I think, you know, when you look at what countries have done in respect of recognition, it really is about saying that in the future there can be no enduring peace unless there are two states side by side.
I have long said that I want to see Israelis and Palestinians to be able to live side by side in peace and security. And there are proposals, obviously, at the moment around and discussions taking place between world leaders. I think the entire international community is distressed by what we're seeing happening in Gaza. But we as well want to see commitments from the Palestinian Authority, commitments of their governance reforms, of reforms in education, reforms across a whole range of issues. We put out that readout in detail after the call, and it was a very constructive discussion with the President. We agreed that we would meet in September in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly.
The Prime Minister, we heard him there. He's also overnight, yesterday in Queenstown, said that any attempt by Israel to take control of Gaza City would risk violating international law. Can you explain how this would violate international law?
Well, firstly, let me make clear that we are opposed to this decision, and we urge Israel not to take this step. Fundamentally, David, we need to see an end to hostilities, and we need to see that now. You know, we've got a humanitarian catastrophe playing out in Gaza. We need to see humanitarian assistance flow to the people in Gaza, and we obviously need to see a return of the hostages from Hamas that are being held in Gaza, and a return of those hostages to their families in Israel. And all of that is best advanced in terms of the return of hostages, but also in terms of the flow of humanitarian assistance if hostilities cease. Now, the blocking of food, the blocking of humanitarian assistance is a breach of international law. And we are obviously deeply concerned about Israel's role in that. And it's why we are really clearly calling for an end to hostilities right now and adding our voice to that of the international community along with, for exactly that call.
If food and aid is flowing, though, but Israel is occupying Gaza City, is that a breach of international law?
Well, we are worried about whether that represents a breach of international law, but our fundamental point here is that food and aid being prevented is a breach of international law, and we're not seeing that food and aid being flowing into Gaza. We are seeing a humanitarian catastrophe play out, but we're also seeing the hostages continue to be held. And fundamentally, what we need to see is an end to hostilities. That's what we are calling for. That is what the international community is calling for, and we will continue to make those calls as loudly as we possibly can.
If there is a concern on Australia's part about international law being violated here, I'm just wondering what further steps might be taken here. Germany is going to block or suspend arms sales to Israel that could be used in Gaza. What about the armoured steel and the F-35 components that Australia contributes? Would they be blocked?
Oh, well, let's be clear. We don't supply weapons to Israel, and we haven't.
The armoured steel and the F-35 components is what I'm asking about.
Well, we're an F-35 country, and we have been that for a couple of decades, and that is a multilateral arrangement with supply chains that are organised by Lockheed Martin in the United States and have multiple suppliers in respect of all of those supply chains. So really, that is a very different question, and we are a part of that process.
What about the armoured steel?
Whatever step we might take. Well, we are not supplying weapons to Israel, and we are an F-35 country, as I say, but that really is a separate issue, and this is about having an impact on Israel. We have made it really clear that we need to see a cessation of hostilities, and that is the fundamental point that needs to be made.
I understand that, but what about selling armoured steel for armoured vehicles?
Well, we are not supplying weapons to Israel, and you know, we have
armoured vehicles is okay.
We are not contributing to that, David, and so let's be clear about that. And we've seen a lot of misinformation in relation to what Australia is doing here. The fundamental point is that we are not supplying weapons to Israel, and there is no step that we could take equivalent to that of Germany, which would have any impact in relation.
Certainly
to
not
Israel.
on the same scale. But
yes,
are you saying that armoured steel from Bisalloy that goes to Rafael Advanced Defence Systems is not being used in armoured vehicles?
What I'm saying is that there is no step that we can take here which has any impact in relation to the activities of Israel. And it is a very different question to what is being talked about in relation to Germany, which obviously has a significant supply into Israel. We want to do everything we can to see an end to the hostilities that are occurring in Gaza. The most important thing that we can do is use our international voice here, and that's what we've been doing.
Just moving on, Donald Trump says a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine could involve some swapping of territories. Ukraine is saying no way. Where does Australia stand on this?
Well, we've been very clear in standing with Ukraine throughout their conflict with Russia. It is Russian aggression. It is a Russian breach of international law, and their invasion of Ukraine, which is at issue here. And really, the rules-based order is what's on trial in the conflict in Ukraine, and it's why we stand side by side with Ukraine. And we have consistently said that this conflict needs to be resolved on Ukraine's terms. Now,
so they shouldn't have to swap
obviously,
territory.
we welcome. Well, this needs to be resolved on Ukraine's terms, and that is the point that we've been making very clearly. Now, in saying that, we obviously welcome any steps that are being taken to bring this war to an end. I mean, there is a human tragedy unfolding, or has been unfolding over the years of this conflict in Ukraine. And we recognise the role of the United States in supporting Ukraine throughout its conflict, but also in seeking to put pressure on Russia to bring this war to an end. And indeed, in the last 12 hours, we've seen Vice President Vance and the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy convene a forum in the UK, which is about supporting Ukraine, but also supporting a pathway to peace, and Australia supports those efforts.
Let me ask you about the Australia-US relationship. The Secretary of State and Defence Secretary are both meant to be coming to Australia for the annual AUSMIN talks this year. Is that still going to happen?
Well, we're talking with the United States around when AUSMIN will occur this year, and that conversation is in process, but we're confident that that will happen.
They'll come here.
Well, one way or another, there'll be an AUSMIN. I mean, we're flexible about how that AUSMIN occurs, and we always are in terms of how AUSMIN has occurred in years past. Well, let's see how it unfolds. Okay. But the kind of conversations that we do are always pretty pragmatic about how best to have this meeting occur wherever it's best for it to occur.
The US wants Australia to lift defence spending to 3.5% of GDP. Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, told you that directly when you last met. The Prime Minister, however, is opposed to setting these sort of arbitrary spending targets. Are you?
Well, I'm in lockstep with the Prime Minister is the short answer to that question. But the Prime Minister is right that the way in which we should think about, and the way in which we have been thinking about the way you fund defence, is firstly to assess what our strategic threat is, and therefore what is our strategic need, and then resource it. And that's what we've been doing. And that process has in fact yielded the biggest peacetime increase in Australia's defence spending in our history.
But people like Angus Houston, Dennis Richardson and others have all said you need to get to 3% of GDP.
Well, the focus is on what our capability requirements are, and then resourcing them. As I said, relative to what we inherited when we came to office from the Morrison government, it's an additional $57 billion over the decade, an additional $10 billion over the forward estimates. In the last 2 financial years, we've spent more on defence procurement than ever. So we are in the process of increasing our spending on defence, and we are doing that by virtue of looking at what our need is and then resourcing it. Now, part of how we've gone about this, but if I can just finish this, is to have a drumbeat now of having a national defence strategy every 2 years. This was actually the recommendation of Angus Houston. That next one of those is due next year in the lead up to next year's budget, and we will consider our needs in the context of that, and we will resource them.
The Pentagon's AUKUS review is dragging on, it seems. Elbridge Colby is indicating it could continue through to November. This does look more than just a new administration running the ruler over the thing. Is this concerning you, the length of this review?
No, I mean, it's the length of the review is pretty similar to the length of our review, the Defence Strategic Review, which in fact took longer, or the length of the UK's review, which again would have taken longer. And we welcome this review, and it is a pretty natural step for an incoming government to run the rule over such a major defence initiative.
Have you spoken to Elbridge
to work out how best to advance it? Well, I've spoken to Elbridge Colby's boss on a number of occasions, and that's the Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth. And I speak to my counterpart, and we have an ongoing dialogue. Okay. And there is support in the United States for AUKUS. You can see that in all the comments that have been made. It is fundamentally in the strategic interests of the United States.
So Pete Hegseth has told you it's fine, it's all okay?
Well, Pete Hegseth is on the record in relation to AUKUS, and I've made it clear that the review is something that we welcome. We will contribute to the review, and we're in constant conversation with the United States about doing that and about the way in which the review is unfolding. But we welcome it. It's an opportunity to make sure that everything is on track and to have the American government as attuned and refined as possible in the pursuit of AUKUS.
The former Prime Minister Scott Morrison has suggested that turning the Henderson shipyards in WA into a joint naval base for Australia and the US would help get the US over the line or keep them on board for AUKUS. Is that something you're open to?
Well, we just need to be a bit careful about how we describe these matters. What we have at HMAS Stirling, south of Henderson, is the proposed submarine rotational force west, which will operate from 2027. Henderson is an industrial precinct, and Premier Cook and I announced the establishment of the Henderson Defence Precinct, which will see the contingency and depot level maintenance of submarines, but will also be the place where we are constructing the landing craft medium, the landing craft heavy for the Australian Army, but in time also the construction of our general purpose frigate, the Megami class frigate, which we announced during the course of the week.
The idea of a joint base either at Henderson or Stirling, is that something you're open to?
Well, we've made clear that part of the optimal pathway is to have the submarine rotational force west at HMAS Stirling,
not as a base, not as a US base.
Well, we don't have foreign bases in Australia. We do have American force posture in Australia. We have the marine rotation in Darwin. We will now have, from 27, the submarine rotation at HMAS Stirling. And in fact, we are seeing American force posture grow in Australia, but it's not through the establishment of bases, which have not occurred under governments of either persuasion in Australia. But to talk about Henderson specifically, it's an industrial precinct and one which is really important as a sovereign asset for our country.
Understand. Just with these rotational forces in the top end, in WA as well, wherever it is, does the US have permission to launch strike missions from Australian soil?
What we have is full knowledge and concurrence arrangements in respect of all the American presence in Australia. And what that means is that any activity that occurs now or in the future has to occur with the concurrence of the Australian government of the time.
That's not approval, though. Would there have to be approval?
Yes, absolutely. That's what full knowledge and concurrence represents. Any new activity or any different activity that is undertaken by the American forces that have a presence in Australia, or for that matter, any other foreign forces which have a presence in Australia, and there are others. Singapore, for example, has a very significant presence in Australia. All of that, any of those activities need to be done with the concurrence, with the approval of the Australian government of the day.
Okay. You're off to Papua New Guinea tomorrow. Australia and PNG are still negotiating a defence treaty. Will PNG troops be allowed to join the Australian Defence Force? Is that being looked at?
It is being looked at, and it's being looked at in the context of the announcement that we've made around expanding engagement in or participation in the Australian Defence Force. As you know, we've now expanded that to firstly New Zealand citizens and now Five Eyes citizens. But at the time of making that announcement, we said that we would have an eye to the Pacific, and PNG is front and centre in relation to that. So, you know, that is a path that we are exploring. There's work to be done before we can get to that point, but it is definitely a path that we are looking at. It's something that PNG is very keen to see happen. As I say, there are a number of steps that we need to iron out before we get there, but that is part of how we are seeing the growing of the Australian Defence Force going forward.
And final one, Richard Marles, away from your portfolio, the Reform Roundtable that's coming up. Do you agree with the Treasurer that more tax reform needs to be considered, or are you with the Prime Minister that you should only do what you took to the election on tax?
Well, I'm with both of them, David. I mean, they're on the same page. There's a nice try in terms of that question.
Look, well, I mean, to be fair, the Treasurer says no sensible progress can be made without more tax reform. The PM says the only tax policy we're implementing is what we took to the election.
The tax policies that we have are what we took to the election, but we need to be lifting productivity in this country. And over the longer term, we need to have a clear eye as to how best to do that. And we're not seeking to constrain the ideas that are put forward at the roundtable next week. It is a really important gathering and an important opportunity to look at all the steps that might be taken in the medium and in the longer term. What we took to the election is our policy, and both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer acknowledge that.
All right, Defence Minister and Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.
And we are going to get to that round table that's coming up towards the, in the middle of next week. First, let's get back to our panel. We're joined once again by Melissa Clarke, Anna Henderson, Sarah Ison. Just to pick up on what we heard there, Mel, in relation to Israel, where we started the conversation. Clearly, the concern is that this will violate international law. Should Benjamin Netanyahu go ahead with what he's said, what the Security Cabinet have approved, they will do. But listening to Richard Marles there, it doesn't sound like further steps of pressure from Australia are necessarily coming beyond what we've seen.
There's certainly no indication from that from Richard Marles or from other government ministers at this point, and I think that's partly out of their oft-repeated refrain of Australia is not a key player in the Middle East and there's limits to what we can do here. I think it's acknowledgement that there are moves that are happening by other nations in an effort to try and prod some kind of change. And while there's been a lot of focus on on France, UK and Canada, what the Arab League states are doing is obviously key here. And the other issue being the US, as you said right from the start, Spearsy, without any kind of pressure from the US, it's very hard to see a change in this direction from Netanyahu, when even the appeals of his own, Defence Force Chief of Staff won't make him reconsider. It's very hard to see anyone else's point of view.
This is potentially, I think, Mel, why, the question about why Australia and other countries would act, and the fact that Israel doesn't appear to be responding. Israel may not be the intended recipient of this message. This may well be, and others in other nations who've been writing on this have been suggesting this is about pressuring Donald Trump.
Yeah.
This is about getting the US to move, and what that would represent, which we all know would be potentially a circuit breaker. And so, how this action is unfolding is difficult for Australia, given all the other balls we have in the air with the United States right now.
I think something that's interesting is, obviously, Richard Marles did say there's no role for Hamas, and that's obviously a big thing for the US as well. It was interesting, though, this morning, Tony Burke was asked about this, and he had some really interesting comments, because when you say no role, it's what does that mean? What does that look like? And Burke said, there have been countries where part of that nation has been occupied, by a terrorist group, and we haven't ceased to recognise that country. He talks about Syria and Iraq had long periods where ISIS had a place. This idea that there's no role for Hamas, but what actually, as with everything, we're not going to recognise Palestine imminently. What does that mean? What does no role mean? These are things that are still to be hashed out. These are things that when the detail emerges from them, that might be when we have an answer to the question about if the US would move as well.
And it absolutely exemplifies the difficulty of this situation. So Israel, Australia, many countries don't want to accept any scenario where there is any role for Hamas. That's why we've seen some international community move towards, well, if we can reform the Palestinian Authority, is that an acceptable outcome? For Israel, no, that's not an acceptable outcome either. And we end up with no progress again. This is going to come back to, we're going to need a break in the status quo, which for all the moves we've seen so far hasn't happened, and we're going to have people involved in the conflict accept that there's not a good outcome here, there's only bad outcomes, and they need to accept that a least worst outcome might be what we need to settle on. And that's also what the Australian government is having to consider, that there might be unpleasant outcomes that need to be swallowed, but least worst is probably the best that can be hoped for in trying to get some kind of broader settlement.
All right. 9 more sleeps until the Reform Roundtable. You can feel the excitement building, right? We'll come to tax and whether there is difference or tension between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. But I want to start with artificial intelligence. Because, look, I think if this roundtable has achieved nothing else, it's at least brought on a much-needed debate around AI, which is already with us, and is going to be increasingly so, how we regulate it, what the rules should be. And there are some very different schools of thought on this. But this week we saw, Sarah, artists, writers, musicians, media executives all mounting a defence of our copyright laws, our Australian content, worried about AI. What's their concern?
Well, the concern is if you offer exemptions for AI for data harvesting, allow an AI model to learn off your songs, your writing, whatever, and let it produce something, how is that going to work when it comes to copyright? And exempting them from copyright law so that they can do more of that, and in the Productivity Commission's view, unleash billions of dollars when it comes to productivity. That shouldn't be what's like the trade-off, essentially.
So the Productivity Commission is saying give them an exemption so they can scrape this stuff and learn about Australia, and then use that.
And, I think the Labor Party does think that the concerns from the arts community, the media industry has merit. I think when I've put this to some people within Labor of like, there's some concerns around this AI thing and giving exemptions, I kind of get a bit of a look of them saying, we're the Labor Party. Like, come on, we're unions, workers, friend of the arts. Like, what do you really think we're going to do here is allow all that to happen? That's not us. So I think that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the Treasurer has said no plans to change that to give them an exemption.
But the problem also is that there are already concerns. Like, it's not like we're going to give them an exemption, and that's the problem. It's
the existing rules aren't strong enough.
Well, you see even on Spotify, this isn't just an example for Australia, but like artists are there's all these copyright issues. The AI is like copying artists' voices and music and uploading that onto Spotify. That's happening, and of course this is a global issue.
It is.
So it's something that even if we don't look at it, reforming laws, there is also a concern that they're not going to be fit for purpose.
Well, this is the argument too this week, right? Are the existing guardrails adequate, or do we need something more? Here is the opposition leader, Susan Lee.
The government needs to put guardrails in place. I'm not hearing from this government about guardrails to protect Australian content.
The idea of additional guardrails wasn't something all of her colleagues seemed to agree on.
This is one of the problems we have in this country. Every time something happens, people say we should have more laws. I mean, more laws is not the answer.
Are they on the same page here?
No, they're not on the same page, and I think there is a lot of disagreement, frankly, across both the parties. There are very differing views within the Labor Party and within the coalition about just how far.
Well, explain that to us, Mel, within the Labor Party between the likes of the Treasurer and the Industry Minister.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got differences there about whether or not we should be looking at a standalone AI Act, for example, as a way to try and ensure that there is very clear and firm regulation, or do we just need to make sure that the current suite of laws that we have are just cognizant of developing technology, make sure the Human Rights Act and the Privacy Act are up to date? The problem is, this is already happening. This isn't a hypothetical question of regulating something that might happen in the future. The example of Spotify is just one of many where, frankly, the horse is already bolted. And for many in the creative industries are saying, well, this is more just about trying to have some kind of sustainability in the future, acknowledging that a lot of the concern about the IP of their work has already been scraped and that has already happened.
This idea of a new AI Act, a new law that oversees all of this stuff, the ACTU wanted. The Productivity Commission is saying, no, existing laws are fine. As a last resort, you do something. The Treasurer says his thinking is aligned with the Productivity Commission.
He's talked about a middle path, though, as well.
A middle path, though, the sort of Goldilocks.
It's aligned and unaligned. I feel it's aligned and unaligned. I think he's both supportive of the work that they're doing and yet willing to walk a path perhaps slightly separate.
But he's not saying he's supportive of what the ACTU is saying, and I think that's significant, that he's not embracing this idea of we're going to need a new act and a new authority to police what's happening in workplaces. I did speak for the podcast this week to Julie Inman-Grant, the e-safety commissioner, as well. We spoke mainly about the report she had during the week on social media companies not doing enough to tackle child sexual abuse content on their platforms. But on this AI argument, whether we need a new AI Act, she's with the Productivity Commission, I think.
I don't think we're there yet, and I just met with my fellow digital regulators from the ACCC, the ACMA, and the Privacy Commissioner last week, and we are trying to harness the regulatory tools that we already have.
And one of the difficulties is, as you mentioned, is this is international. What can Australia do on its own with any of this stuff to get the rules right when these big tech companies and their AI are changing the world.
And can they keep up, right? Like, because this is the idea with this, like, you know, there's a desire to regulate, but we're already at ChatGPT version 5 or something, right? Like, by the time we get through the systems that we need to, because that's how Parliament works, there'll be level 6, 7, 8. Like, this is the other problem. Interestingly, just back on the coalition, as much as there is a bit of disagreement in terms of the messaging to begin, there is also a bit of an appetite in the coalition to try to focus on this. A number of people have told me they think this could be the defining issue of this term, just because last term a few versions of ChatGPT came out, now we're really far progressed. There's a potential for them to try to really seek to wedge Labor. You've got, you know, more unionists who are really worried. You've got productivity minded.
Wedge them how? By saying there needs to be more regulation or there needs to be no regulation?
I think probably more trying to make sure there's more productivity gains, I think, with good guardrails in place. Right now, I think Labor wants to do a bit of everything, and the coalition thinks because it's not as hampered by unions, it can probably be a bit clearer, right? But there are other people in the coalition who think they don't have the resources anyway to respond to the day-to-day issues at the moment. Suddenly focusing on, like, let's really make AI a bigger issue.
I think they're right that this is coming at governments all around the world, right?
It's been creeping up on the Parliament.
Yep.
It has been it's been stomping around the Parliament, and it's like people have willfully ignored it until they realised they could use it to write a parliamentary speech every now and again.
Right. Is that happening?
Aaron Violi did the first one, and then Julian Hill.
Remember Anne Ruston saying that she had used AI to help understand what went wrong for the Liberal Party in the election campaign?
Yes,
it was on this show.
That's right, on this show. I saw a British MP during the week who set up an AI version of himself to answer constituents' questions. It's like, wow, really? Anyway.
But this is it. This is the thing with innovation. It gets beyond the bounds of what we previously know. And if it isn't considered in some way, whether that's looking at the current regulatory framework, whether that's a whole new AI Act, the point is, if the Parliament doesn't have some kind of conclusion of a way to deal with this, it'll end up in the courts. And it'll be a legal case that deals with it, and it'll be far messier and far more complicated.
I want to talk about tax because that's another big part of what's being discussed, and we've had a lot of ideas, 1,000 flowers blooming. We had Sally McManus on this show last week talking negative gearing, capital gains tax, fringe benefits tax. We've had Kate Chaney talking GST. We've had the Productivity Commission talking company tax.
ACOS.
All of that. The Prime Minister, though, a bit of a party pooper here, saying, look, don't expect big tax changes immediately coming out of this roundtable.
This is a roundtable, just that. It is not more than that. It's not a replacement of the Cabinet. We're not contracting out our decision-making processes. The only tax policy that we're implementing is the one that we took to the election.
So the only tax change is what we took to the election. It doesn't rule out something going to the next election. I don't know if we can wait that long for tax reform, but is there a difference here between the PM and the Treasurer?
Look, there's definitely a difference in ambition and I think outlook of how ambitious a government can be at this point in the cycle. I don't think there's necessarily a big policy divide here between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, but you do have a Treasurer who is keen and eager to make a mark and to do what the government can with the very big majority that it now has.
Which has been the way through history. Keating, Hawke.
Absolutely.
Costello, Howard.
You can describe the Prime Minister in many ways, but he is not inconsistent when it comes to his message of saying he wants to build trust with an electorate. He doesn't want to spring surprises on people. He wants to give people time to consider new ideas and get a mandate at a ballot box. I think that means that discussion we have about tax now helps build a case for 3 years down the track. And they're not going to agree to something at this point in the electoral cycle and not try and take it to the people and give the opposition 3 years to shoot it down.
I think, and look, he knows a thing or two about winning elections. Anthony Albanese has shown that. And jacking up the GST or making a negative gearing change 5 minutes.
It's not going to help them at this point politically.
No, but look, the Treasurer's Department, the Treasury, issued an issues paper during the week. And I just wanted to show you this because I thought it was interesting. A couple of graphs that they put in there, the Treasury. One, income tax. You can see the reliance on income tax is going to go up and up and up. And the other one, where are the tax breaks at the moment going? It shows they're going to the highest income earners, superannuation, capital gains tax breaks. Why is Treasury keen to highlight these things, if not to make the case for reform?
Put them front of mind.
Yeah, something to think about.
And I feel like if there's one thing that Labor, everything that Mel said, I completely agree with. This is not about a stage 3 scare the horses Mark II moment. This is about laying out an agenda, ventilating issues towards the next election. But also, the government saw the HEX announcement that they made to give young people a break on their HECS bill. It's hugely popular, not just amongst young people, but amongst their parents and grandparents. And it changed people's votes because Australians realise that there is intergenerational theft in the system, that young people do not have it as good as their parents and grandparents, and that the system is stacked against them. And so I feel like around that oval table, rather than round table in the cabinet room, as I recently discovered, with limited seating, that will be there as well. Yes, it's about productivity, but I think it's also about noting that many young voters are aware that they feel ripped off by the Australian system.
That's where the debates around negative gearing come in. All right, we've got to move on, but we'll talk more about that oval table meeting that's coming up very soon. Our panel, Sarah, Ison, Anna Henderson and Mel Clarke, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers, and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with columnist for The Australian, the one and only Jack the Insider. Very warm welcome back.
G'day, Mike. Good to be here.
Jack, the situation in Gaza, it seems public opinion is starting to switch around a little bit.
Some big rallies, and this is reflected in Megan Herbert's cartoon here.
Yep, with the slowly moving shadow round to too late.
Yes, almost getting towards too late. Very, very grim pics coming from Gaza.
Yeah, whatever happens, the shadow of this conflict is going to be a very long one, Jack.
It's going to go on for a long time.
I love Glenn Lever. He's got the Prime Minister's in and out trays here. Anthony Albanese.
In tray starving Palestinian, out tray Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's still moving slowly.
Yeah.
Kathy Wilcox has got someone deriding the protests last weekend. It was a hateful, dangerous demonstration of extremist and terrorist sympathisers, and I should know because I wasn't there. 100,000 March for Peace. Mark Knight, he can turn anything into a Sydney-Melbourne fight, can't he? Looks like Melbourne has lost its mantle as the protest capital of Australia, with the Melburnian...
looking a bit horrified.
Yeah, the scream.
Oh, I know the Melbourners will be back.
I did love this. Brett Lethbridge is a tricky border crossing here with the Prime Minister delicately negotiating the Star of David barbs on the wire.
Yes, it is a delicate little walk towards recognition, and he's just poking his way, and he's got a couple of rips.
Yeah. Jack, a lot of people are blowing AI's trumpet, but others fear that it's leading to algorithm and blues. Kathy Wilcox cartoon here.
It's marvellous, really. You just feed in all the intellectual property you can get your hands on without paying for it, then sell whatever comes out this end. Yeah. So, yes, as an author, we get a little bit miffed when our stuff just gets lifted without any warning, and then generally a tech billionaire will get to monetise it.
Yeah. Kathy Wilcox sees this as artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, yes. I think we're going to need a bigger bucket. Ooh, much bigger than that.
David Pope sees the robot has bolted the stable somewhat here.
Yes.
We're building it with legs so it doesn't need guardrails.
Yeah, that's the idea, that you would just simply not bother regulating.
Yeah, don't shut the stable door now. It'll eventually need somewhere to crash. Fiona Katauskas has outlined some of the problems here.
Well, if you ignore the job losses, intellectual property theft, huge environmental costs, disinformation, and the fact that it's making some of the biggest jerks on earth brain-bendingly rich, it really will be a boon for humanity. 4.8% improvement on our productivity.
Mainly through job losses. Jack, they say that there's no place like home except when they want you to return to work at the office. Lovely Glenn Lever cartoon here with some of the options from working from home.
Yes, when you work from home, you can just press the button, walk the dog. You can go pantsless.
Gaze into the abyss.
Oh, yeah. Look, I might feel tempted towards watching a few cat videos.
Hang on,
I'm hungry.
Order pizza.
Order a pizza.
I love this Matt Golding cartoon. It's channeling Get Smart. Are we getting smarter as the cone of silence lowers onto the desk here?
God. With Max there.
With the chief.
Who's working from home.
Yes, Max.
Probably pantsless.
Yes, Max. I know it's your legislated right to work from home twice a week, but do you have to insist we zoom inside the cone of silence? Chaos.
What? Anything that references Get Smart is going to be funny. Well done.
Jack, it seems like politics around the world is in a state, and there's no state like Tasmania. 5-week campaign, and they're back exactly where they started.
Pretty much.
Lovely Chris Downs cartoon, the revolving door, the new door of Parliament House.
Look, is that the Tasmanian Premier? Who knows? You know, the cartoonist's trick should be to put Tasmanian Premier on the briefcase there, so we all know. But I guess we get the general thrust of it, that is a man trying to get into a revolving door that is the Tasmanian Parliament.
Jack, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
My pleasure. And it's back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Sarah.
Childcare has been talked about for a couple of weeks with the concerns for children's safety. But what's also happened is there's a growing discussion within Labor about how fit for purpose the system is, the for-profit system in particular. And this is really a drive towards a greater overhaul. And of course, we know Anthony Albanese wants universal childcare to be something he achieves. So this could be part of a greater momentum build, and we could start seeing some discussions, particularly at the roundtable, of a bit of overhaul in terms of how something's funded, paid for. And I think that's going to play out in the next couple of weeks.
Interesting. Anna.
I just want to pick up where Bridget Brennan left off last week, because I was also at the Garma Festival where there was this sort of plaintive cry from so many across the country in the Indigenous affairs space for something to be done in the Northern Territory, because the justice system under the unicameral parliament with the huge majority CLP government is leading to more children being locked up. And, you know, there's very good reasons the CLP government says for the process it's undertaking to keep its communities safe. But there's now international focus on this, including from the United Nations. So the government hasn't answered a lot of questions about what's next in terms of potential for federal government money to be affected by closing the gap measures not being implemented in the NT. And it's a real hanging question.
It is. Mel.
I think Australia should be looking really closely at the relationship between the US and India right now, which the Indians are very frustrated by the very high level of tariff that Donald Trump has imposed on their country. It certainly seems to be pushing Narendra Modi away from what was a very cosy relationship between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi over recent years. And that potentially is bad news for Australia, because there's now a lot of talk that maybe the Quad meeting that was due to happen in New Delhi might now have to happen on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. We know Narendra Modi is now looking at a visit to China. The whole point of the Quad was that it would bring India into discussions that Australia, Japan and Australia already have. And it's important for Australia because it gives the Australian Prime Minister a seat at the table with Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. If the Quad is diminished because of what is developing between the US and India, that's bad news for Australia, because it risks diminishing one of the few opportunities Australia has to have its most senior person at the table, at a small table, with some of the most important statesmen in the world.
It's a very good point, and definitely a concern for Australia if that falls away or
if that's another opportunity to have that meeting.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, here's something you don't see too often. A politician refusing to wear a high-vis vest. New Zealand's Winston Peters put up a fashion fight during a site visit for a new rail link, and in the end, the vest won. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for coming. Why do we need that? This is not a safety zone area. Well, what's the risk at all, but just you guys say so?
It's
tell me.
It's just for protection.
That has no benefit at all. I'm serious about not wasting taxpayers' money, mate.
No, I know. We have this gear for all of our visitors, so it's, we're not spending any extra money, I can assure you.
Who the hell put you up to it?
No, it's part of our health and safety protocol.
Is that your vest there?
Yeah, you stay there too.
Oh.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.